Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 37 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar programme. I'm delighted to say we've got Ruth Bell here again for a fourth and final webinar of 2015. Ruth's going to be talking today about validation of food safety control measures. I'll leave it up to Ruth to tell you about it, so I won't read the synopsis, but there's a lot of confusion about verification, validation, how to do it properly. We always get lots of questions on the discussion forum about it. So hopefully today, Ruth will put our minds to rest once and for all about the subject. I'd just like to say at this point, thanks to the sponsors who've supported us throughout 2015, Trace Analytics, Safe Food 360, FSSC 22000 and IFS. We are going to be running webinars next year again for 2016. We're currently in the process of making the program for that. We'll be launching that in the next couple of weeks, so keep your eye out for that. Ruth is there. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, good afternoon.
It looks like sunny Yorkshire today.
There's a tiny bit of sun, but not too much. There's an awful lot of wind and rain.
I know there's more to come this weekend, I think. So,
yes.
But we can definitely see a bit of sun radiating through your window there, which is it's nice. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just tell the audience about next week's webinar, and then I'll come back to you for the presentation shortly, Ruth.
Great. Okay.
Okay. Next week, we think we've got a webinar. It's food and beverage authenticity with a chap called Mehmet. Thus far, we've been unable to make contact, so we're not sure 100% whether it will be going ahead next week. So I'm not putting it in the sidebar for you to register. We'll do that by email once we've definitely finalised that. It's a shame if we can't do that because food authenticity is a big subject at the moment. Okay, I'm going to be sharing the presentation today because we've got a few technical problems, so please bear with us. But here we go. Over to Ruth. Can you see the slide, Ruth?
Yes, I can. Yes, okay. Thank you.
Just tap me on the head when you want me to change it. Okay.
Great. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to this overview, really, of validation of control measures. Okay, so we can go to the next one.
Okay. So
just very, very quickly, a little bit about me. I work as a consultant in the food industry. I have a background in technical management and quality management, mainly in the dairy sector, so ice cream processing, cheese processing, milk processing. But I now work with businesses to help them to set up their quality and food safety management systems based around the majority of the GFSI standards. Along with that, there's all the TACONs, the ethical and the TACCP, the VASCP, allergen awareness, all of those types of things. I also offer technical and legal support to businesses and work as a third-party auditor for some of the GFSI standards. Okay, great. Next one. So I represent AF Associates, and we are international food safety and quality management specialists, helping businesses of all sizes in both the feed and the food industry at all stages of the food chain, really, to help system development with some of the standards advice, as I say, the legislation, technical support, and we also offer training courses both face-to-face in-house and via e-learning in a variety of different topics. So that's enough about us, and now to get on to have a think about today's webinar and what we're going to include. Okay. So today it's all about validation of control measures. We haven't got long, so it's very much an overview, but just really trying to define validation and separate out what is validation and what is verification, because there is quite a lot of confusion about the two and what's involved in both. So we're going to have a think as well where validation sits within the Codex 12-step logic sequence, because it's very well hidden. and then just briefly talk you through the process of validation and the practical validation, theoretical validation of our HACCP system and our control measures. Great. Okay. So where did it all fit? Well, it's within our food safety management systems, and we all very well know that HACCP is really well established in manufacturing for both food and feed as a tool to use to ensure the safety of our food products by being a preventative system. And how HACCP's evolved, it's very much focused on the process and controlling the process, rather than historically food safety was managed through controlling the product and end product testing. There are a lot of limitations with testing the product at the end, whereas if you know your process is in control, you can then by default virtually say that I am producing a safe product, provided you have got that correct process, and provided that you do monitor your process and know that it's in control. So this is where we start to introduce the idea of validation. Okay, can we have the next slide? Thank you. But the problem really is, how do you know that your process is designed and is working on a day-to-day basis correctly, so that it does ensure that we are producing a safe product? And this is through both validation and verification. But what we really have to do is start to distinguish the difference between the two and understand when we need to be validating and when we need to be verifying. So next one. Okay. So first of all, before we get going, I thought we could put a poll out as to do you know or do you understand the difference between validation and verification? So at the moment it's just yes, you think you do, or no, you're not too sure.
Okay, I've loaded that in the sidebar if you'd like to click on one of those answers, yes or no. And wow, that's quite surprising actually. The vast majority do know the difference between validation and verification.
Great.
It's about 85% to 15%. 85% do and 15% don't.
Oh, that's great then.
Positive.
Yes. You
can go on. You can go on.
We can. Yes, we can move on. So we'll move on to the next slide. So when we start to look within our 12-step logic sequence of how to apply the Codex HACCP principles, if you actually look at the 12 steps, it doesn't anywhere mention the word validation. We've actually got to dig within the 6th Codex HACCP principle, which is establish verification procedures, and validation is hidden within that 6th principle, or the 11th in year 12-step logic sequence. And establishing verification procedures, it's all about making sure that the food safety management system is working. And so some of the activities that are actually involved within that Principle 6 verification are both validation, verification, as well as ongoing maintenance of the food safety management system and reviewing the food safety management system. So the Codex HACCP Principle 6 really does cover a variety of different activities, and I think this is one of the first problems, that validation does tend to get lost in amongst everything else. Okay, can we have the next slide? Thank you. So if we're thinking about verification as part of Principle 6, or the 11th in the 12 steps, the basic role is to make sure that the food safety management system, or the HACCP plan, is functioning as it's been designed, and that it is effective on an ongoing period of time, so that we've got the design right, we've got the science right, we've got the technical information right, and then on a day-to-day basis that plan is being used and it is effective in controlling our food safety hazards and giving us confidence that we are producing safe food. Great. Can we have the next one? I quite like this definition. This is the NACMCF definition of validation, and they actually recognise that validation is part of verification, and what they're saying is that validation is the element of verification focused on collecting and evaluating scientific and technical information to determine if the HACCP plan, when properly implemented, will effectively control the hazards. So it's all about looking at where you've got your information from, the justification for your decisions, and asking if we follow this plan on paper that we've got documented, is it correct? Will it give us a safe product? So I think this is really good because it does recognise that validation is part of your verification activities. Okay, next one. And I think this table represents it very nicely, because validation as a subcomponent of verification. So if you look at verification principle 6, it does have two very distinct strands to it. We've got the validation. In other words, is your HACCP plan technically valid? Is it scientifically sound? And then we talk about verification for compliance. In other words, are we doing what our plan says that we should be doing on a day-to-day basis? There's an awful lot of confusion about the terminology and people's understanding of what verification activities actually involve. And I think the confusion has come because the term verification is actually used with two different meanings. So if you're referring to verification as the big principle 6, it does mean that you will be doing elements of validation, you will be doing elements of verification for compliance, along with ongoing maintenance and review. But very often we talk about verification and we're actually just meaning the smaller part, the compliance element. So validation and verification are very definitely separate activities, and they're conducted at different stages within the design, the development and the operation of a HACCP system. Great. Next one. Thank you. So what we're saying is validation is the processes and the activities that we do to make sure that all the food safety control measures that we've identified will be capable of actually being effective and producing safe product. And it's all the activities that we need to go through to make sure that those control measures are going to work when we use them on a day-to-day basis. So it's absolutely essential that we validate our control measures before we implement them. If that isn't done, it is actually possible to implement an invalid plan and then to verify for compliance and say that you're in compliance. So for example, you may have been setting a critical limit on a thermal process. You've got the critical limit incorrect. But when you come to verify for compliance, so long as you are hitting that critical limit in terms of compliance, you'd be saying, yes, we're achieving what we said we should have been doing. So I think this really highlights the importance of validation and making sure that our processes and our control measures have been validated so that we do know that they will be capable of giving us a safe product. Next. If we really break it down, I like simple, and I think validation basically splits down into, will it work? In other words, you're looking at your document and you're saying, if we use this, will it give us a safe product? Is it the right thing to do? As opposed to verification, which is asking, is it working? And are we doing what we say we should be doing? Okay. So we've just got another quick poll to ask, have you conducted validation studies? So either a yes or a no.
Just bear with me a second.
Yep.
Have you conducted validation studies? Right, I'm setting that poll in the sidebar as we speak. So when that appears, if you could just vote. And the shape of the poll is about 70-30 have conducted validation studies.
Great. Great.
Okay.
That's good then.
Right. Okay.
Yes, on we go.
Right.
Okay, so the actual process of validation, when we come on to think how we're going to validate, there are two main methods that we would use. You can validate theoretically, and this is by ensuring that what you've got documented on paper is correct and will give you that safe product. And then we can validate practically and experimentally, and this is where we are asking ourselves, will the control measures be capable of controlling the hazard and preventing it, reducing it, eliminating it down to a safe level. So when we begin to validate, generally it's a combination of both theoretical validation and practical experimental validation. When we do validate, it generally occurs at 3 times. You would be validating during the design of a HACCP system, and at the end of the design of a HACCP system, there's always a need for ongoing revalidation. That's generally done on an annual basis. And the one that has to trigger is a revalidation due to change. And that's the one where even the smallest of changes to a process or to a recipe or to a product can have a significant impact on food safety. And if we don't pick that up, we can end up with control measures that become invalid. So if we first of all have a look at the theoretical validation, so that's the next one. Okay, this we tend to look theoretically as we're designing a HACCP system and at the end of design, and this perhaps looks slightly bigger than the control measures, because theoretical validation would actually look at the whole of your HACCP document and the whole of your HACCP plan, and the main aim of it is to make sure that any justifications, any decisions are based on some sort of scientific evidence, and they're not on company custom, where the classic line you often hear is, we've been doing it like this for 40 years and we haven't had a problem, so why do we have to make any changes? But where has the science come from? What has been used? We have to make sure in particular, though, that any controls that we're putting in place will be able to achieve safety at CCPs, at control points, but also within the prerequisite programs. And any type of validation, whether it's the practical validations, whether it's the theoretical validations, have to be documented. So all the information that we've used as part of a validation needs to be gathered and it needs to be retained, because it's evidence, it's justification that what you're using is and will be effective. Okay, next. So perhaps theoretically, as we're going through and designing a HACCP system, and at the end of the design of a HACCP system, when you've got a sort of a whole document, you will be beginning to go through some of the things that you'd be looking at. You'd need to look at the team, and have we got a valid team? In other words, are the team capable? Are the team competent? Are the team trained? Do the team have knowledge and experience in the particular area that we're looking to put a system in? You would need to look at the terms of reference and just make sure that everything within the terms of reference was technically correct, that we've got the right information in there, that we've got the right scope, we're identifying the correct type of hazards for the product. So the general information within the scope is correct. And probably the only place within the 12-step logic sequence that does actually make some reference to carrying out some checking is the process flow diagram and confirmation of the process flow diagram. So once we've got that, then you would be theoretically coming on to look at all the control measures and really asking, have we got the control measures correct? Are they suitable? Will they control the hazard? Will they reduce, prevent, eliminate? So for instance, if you've identified a hazard as presence of pathogenic microorganism in product due to poor supplier controls, a control measure of temperature control isn't going to be effective. Your control measure would need to be based around supplier quality assurance. So it's making sure that we've got the right control measure. We'd be needing to look at the CCPs, looking at how the CCPs have been identified, what methodology has been used, have we used a decision tree, has it been used correctly, have the team been using just a team decision-making process, and really starting to try to determine, have we got the right CCPs, has anything been missed? Sometimes when you're looking for validity, it's more what's been missed rather than what's there. Have we got all the significant hazards? Have we missed anything? Critical limits, where's the critical limit come from? How have you defined your critical limit? What parameters have you used? What have you sourced that information from? Then we have to start to determine whether the process is and will be capable of actually achieving those critical limits. So this is where we get a little bit more into the practical validation, which I'll come on to talk about in a moment. Theoretically also, though, you need to be looking at the monitoring procedures, the corrective action procedures, and just asking, if we followed this monitoring procedure through, would it actually detect loss of control, and would the corrective actions put our system back into control again? Okay, the next one. So we do a lot of theoretical validation, but we also need to practically challenge our controls. And when we're thinking about conducting validation studies, there are several steps. I suppose if you're familiar with the plan, do, check, act cycle, that's pretty much what we need to do. You need to decide on your approach to how you're going to practically challenge your controls. So are you going to do some theoretical studies, perhaps around where you've got your critical limit from? Are you going to do some experimental studies, perhaps some challenge testing? Are you going to do data collection in normal day-to-day production? Are you going to use statistical process control? So you need to decide on how you're going to conduct your validation studies and what combination of approaches you're perhaps going to use. You also need to define the parameters that you're going to base your judgment about the validity of your control measure on. So are you looking for a log reduction with microorganisms? Are you looking for verification of a cleaning system? What are you going to set as those parameters? It might be microbiological criteria, for instance. Once you've decided on the actual approach that you're going to take and the parameters that you're working within and you're going to measure your effectiveness against, you would then go ahead and actually practically conduct this validation studies. So roll your sleeves up and get going. This would generate a lot of information from which you can then go on and analyze the results, and working that back to the parameters that you defined, determine whether your control measure is valid or not. And the final thing, of course, is that all this would be documented. So practically, it's all about challenging your controls, basically to push them to determine how and when you are likely to get a failure, and what would happen if you got a failure. And it's really thinking about what are the collection of causes that would give you a failure, and if it did happen, what your outcome would be. So it's looking at what you've currently got in place, and do you need to put any additional controls to give you more confidence that your system is going to perform over time, and your HACCP will become more effective. Okay. So a lot of practically challenging our controls would take us into statistical process control, your SPC, and it's all about confirming the process is capability. If you remember, I said that HACCP is process-led, so it is all about understanding that your process is working and knowing the limits on that that process. So do we understand our processing capability at particular points in the process where you've defined control measures? Processes don't always generate perfect outputs, and there will always be some deviations, but so long as those deviations stay within our common cause variation, we can confirm that the process is capable. And the less deviations that we can get, then the more we can confirm that our process is effective. So as much as possible, this is where we need to understand our process and our processing capabilities. Have we designed the control measures, the procedures effectively? How are you going to continually measure to determine that your process is effective? And how do you measure any any errors, I can't speak, and how do you approach sort of putting things right again? Okay, next one. So in terms of your process capability, it's all about the statistical verification. It's all about the probability or the confidence that you have that you're going to be able to stay within specified limits. So initially, theoretically, with control measures, you will have set those limits based on some sort of legislation, some sort of science, some sort of customer guidance. And now within your processing capability, you have to determine if your process, each time it runs, is capable of staying within those limits. So when we validate our process capability, can we do the next slide?
Sure.
We've really got two considerations that we need to think about. Is the process capable of achieving the particular control that you've put in place? So are you capable of achieving the critical limit that's been established, for instance? So that critical limit, where have you got it from? And is your process going to be able to achieve that each and every time? And the other one is your process capable of consistently controlling the hazard and achieving the critical limit? So this is where we start to really push a process and think about worst case scenario and conduct some processing capability studies. Can we have a look at the next one? Okay. So as I said, all processes are subject to some natural and inherent variability, which is your common cause variation. And so long as you can stay within that, you can say that your process is statistically in control. It's when we get special cause variation due to unpredictable errors, that's when we start to have problems. So long as we know the range over which the process is capable, then we can begin to determine that our control measure will be effective. So some of the things that you would have to start to think about if you're looking at a worst case scenario. So for example, on a thermal process, you might be looking at the equipment capabilities. So you'd be looking at the heat penetration within the equipment. So for instance, within an oven, you would need to be finding out where the hot spots are, where the cool spots are, where's the slowest heating point, where's the warmest heating point, fastest heating point. And so you can really determine the points where you would need to put your product to determine worst case. You might be looking at the equivalence of two different types of equipment. You may have two different ovens. They don't necessarily behave the same. You would need to look at maintenance, because sometimes over a period of time, equipment starts to need some maintenance, maybe not working just quite as effectively. If you're talking about a thermal process and you've got temperature gauges on there, are they calibrated? Do they need calibrating over time? They may begin to slip. So it's very much looking at the equipment. If you were introducing things like steam, pressure, does the pressure drop at different times of the day? So it's really beginning to work out what would be, in terms of the equipment capabilities, its worst case. you might be thinking around the actual product that you're putting in, and the nature of the product itself, and the temperature distribution within a product. So different sizes, the largest, coldest product in the slowest heating point in the oven begins to give you your worst case. Other things that you would be looking at, though, would be around staff competency. So if you're talking about people maintaining equipment, have you got personnel that are competent? Do they know what they're doing? Staff running the actual process, are they competent? This is where the boundaries perhaps of validation and verification can become a little bit blurred. But in terms of validation, it's really looking at the design of training programs, and if staff were trained in a particular operating procedure, will they then be able to manage that process effectively? So it's looking at the training, it's looking at also possible sampling and testing. And when you're validating processes, this is the time where you perhaps have the luxury of being able to test to destruction. On day-to-day production, we can't 100% sample and test because we wouldn't have a product to sell. Whereas when you're conducting validation studies, you certainly can test and sample and destroy to determine that we have got the particular parameters that we need. Okay, can we do the next slide? Okay. So, as I say, to confirm your process capability, it's really making sure that the process is only subject to your common cause variation, so that it is in statistical process control, and that as much as possible we can minimise all the common causes. So is by understanding the process and understanding the worst case, and then, if necessary, putting extra controls in place just to make sure that we are within our process control. Okay, next one. So particularly around looking at the processes and the equipment, you might be asking, have we adequately delivered a lethal step? So is the process, if you're looking to achieve a 6-log reduction, will your thermal process do that? So we would be testing to understand if we could achieve that. We certainly would be needing to determine that we had got the right critical parameters, firstly theoretically, and then that on an ongoing basis we're able to control those. You might be having to look at things like where are you locating data loggers and temperature sensors, particularly in cooking processes, cooling processes, so that they are giving you the correct information. You might also be looking at tolerances around temperature sensors. So if we're talking about plus or minus 0.5, we need to build that into our control measures. There may be times when temperature sensors can be affected. For instance, in a CIP system, if you're running the CIP, you can cause some damage sometimes to some of the temperature sensors. Is the startup procedure adequate? If we're bringing things up to temperature, we're beginning to cool things down before we put product into a process. Things like the product itself, does it go into a process from an ambient temperature? Is it going in from chilled temperature? Is it going in from frozen temperature? Just occasionally things are defined to go in from ambient and they're going from chilled. The process isn't capable. The process will fail. Corrective actions definitely have to be defined. They need to be adequate. Will they identify the problem? Will they control contain the product? Will they contain the problem if we follow them through? So I've mentioned the incoming material temperature, but other things that you might look at around the process itself. Have you got separation of areas? Is that adequate to control the potential of contamination and cross-contamination? So a lot of things we need to think about within the process and the equipment. A little bit more about the equipment. Have we got the next slide? Okay. When you do look at validating equipment, you can do it in one of two ways. It could be by the use of surrogate microorganisms. I do hasten to add there surrogate microorganisms we need to be using. The last thing we can start doing is putting pathogenic microorganisms into a process. Might cause us a few problems a little bit later on. So one of the initial problems that we've got is to determine what would be an adequate surrogate microorganism to use that would behave in a similar way to the particular microorganism that we're really trying to destroy. And the second thing that we can do is to just look practically at the processing parameters in relation to the control measure that we've established. Okay, so can we have the next one? So, as I say, a little bit of a recap around your processing parameters. It's making sure that your critical limits, any processing parameters that you're going to work to, have been established from some sort of science, and that they are applicable to the process that you're looking at. There's no point in trying to achieve a botulinum cook on a pasteurizing process. It's all got to be relevant. We need to make sure that we understand any process variability, and that we can stay within a common cause variation. So I've just given an example there of unevenness of roasting. You need to make things as similar as possible, but within the bounds of what you're trying to do. It may be that if we do see a lot of differences, that you would have to go back and you would have to revalidate. You would have to perhaps change parameters. You might have to change how the process works and how the process operates. Definitely, though, we need to be running equipment in worst case scenario, having found out sort of the worst case conditions, the most critical conditions. If the process is capable of achieving safety in those conditions, it should be capable in what we might consider more normal conditions. We do need to make sure that all the parameters are being correctly monitored, and that your material is being processed. And we need to make sure that we're recording all of the monitoring parameters so that we've got evidence there. And should we need to do any investigations, that information is going to be there and going to be available. And the final one, just to recap, is make sure that we're aware of the tolerance on any measuring devices, so that you've set limits, building that tolerance in. Okay, the next one. It's sort of stands to reason that any process and monitoring equipment, we're going to have to make sure that it is there, it is available, and it is in place, and that the monitoring equipment will be actually capable of achieving what you're looking for. So, for instance, if you've got a thermal process and you're wanting to monitor with some form of temperature probe, and you want to monitor to 3 decimal places, you've got to make sure that the equipment is capable of giving you 3 decimal places, and that it is properly calibrated, and it's calibrated to a national standard, so we've got confidence in the readings that we're getting. Okay. What I've been talking about is very much what you would do if you were designing a new HACCP plan, or you were designing a new control measure, whether it is at a CCP or whether it is just at a control point, or whether it's a practical control measure that sits within one of the prerequisite programs. So we very definitely need to know that these controls will work before we go live and implement them. But then on an ongoing basis, we do need to revalidate our food safety management system and our HACCP plan. Generally, this does happen annually, but it may be more frequently. This is sometimes based around standards requirements, around customer requirements. And what you're doing when you're revalidating is just assessing how effective the plan has been over time. And it's a chance to go back and re-challenge any initial decisions, re-challenge controls. So sometimes revalidation is done, some of it is theoretical, and you would just be looking back at the plan over time and asking, is it still true? Is it still effective? Is it still valid? But this is also an opportunity to revalidate some of the practical controls as well, and just with the beauty of hindsight now, you can go back and perhaps look at data that you've gathered just to reconfirm that some of the processes are still valid and still capable of achieving the controls that you're looking for. So ongoing revalidation is really essential. Can we do the next slide? And as I say, most of that you can study historical data, because we generate a raft of data. It may be that you were looking at the validation of a cleaning process, and you could go back and you could look back over your data, and that would help you to confirm that over a 5-month period, a 2-month period, a 3-week period, whatever you're looking at, you could use that data and confirm that yes, our process was in control. Or alternatively, it could be by conducting further validation trials and further experimentation. Okay, next one. This is the key one, though, that revalidation prompted by change. This could happen at any stage, and this is where the HACCP team or the food safety management team really need to be keeping up to date with what's going on and any changes, and there needs to be mechanisms in place to make sure that any changes are passed through the food safety management team or the HACCP team for consideration. Because even a really minor change, perhaps in a pH, we may move from pH 4.5 to a pH 4.6, which could have a really significant impact on the safety of your products. It's common for it to happen. We change perhaps a raw ingredient, and it's just, as I say, the pH is slightly different, and you'll start to perhaps see some issues coming through. Maybe there's a lot of work going on at the moment reformulating, reducing salt content. Salt acts as an inhibitor. It could be that you've reduced salt content, you haven't gone back and revalidated your HACCP plan, and then find in the future that you're starting to get some problems and some issues. And this is where our proactive system would fail and would start to cause problems, because the way they would manifest themselves would be as a possible injury or a possible food poisoning outbreak, recalls and withdrawals. So revalidation prompted by change, it can happen at any time, and the HACCP team really does need to keep abreast of what's going on, and possibly at that stage conduct further experimentation on control measures. Okay, next one. But at whatever stage, whether it's at the design stage, whether it's at the end of design, whether it's your annual revalidation or a revalidation prompted by change, we need to be documenting all the validation activities. We need to keep records of the trials. They're all justifications. They're all evidence that you have validated your control measures, that you know your process is capable of producing a safe product. It gives you confidence, but it will also be there as evidence to provide to anybody else that's looking at your HACCP system. We've talked very much about validating control measures, you looking at your own control measures within your own operation. It could be that you also go and or need to go and look at suppliers and maybe validating the control measures of suppliers. There you perhaps haven't got the beauty of being able to roll your sleeves up and conduct practical validation trials. So certainly if you were going externally and looking at suppliers, it would be very much looking theoretically at their decision-making process, and then secondly looking for the evidence of their validation activities. So this is why keeping evidence is so key, because so many people will be asking for your information to see that you have validated your activities. Okay, and just the last one. We've got a little bit of a poll there. Do you think you would now change how you approach validation? Either a yes or a no.
So hopefully you've learned something today. So this will be a barometer. So a good 70-odd% obviously have picked something up today that they will make a change to their approach to validation. So well done, Ruth.
Oh,
round of applause to you, Ruth.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I think it's the clear thing is to separate out validation activities from verification activities. Very often validation is actually done, but it sort of slips in under the radar. People don't realize they're doing it because a lot of what we are talking about as validation as part of our food safety management system is often referred to as commissioning in of new equipment, and it's just tying up that link really and making sure that any control measures, you have got the evidence that you know you can produce safe product.
Yeah.
So great. Okay. Happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great. That was quite difficult, me trying to
yes.
share that, but we've managed it. Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Ruth.
Okay.
We will take questions. Just one thing from me first. I'm well known as being a very poor navigator in my car, but with my family, always getting lost. So what I tend to do is just set off. If we're going on a family day out, I'll just set off driving, and then I'll be counting the miles. I'll be looking at my speedometer, doing 70 miles an hour and thinking, we've gone another mile, everything's great, and then realize we're in completely the wrong place. So if I do validation at the start of the journey, you know, look at a map, perhaps get some instructions, look at the literature, and make it scientific instead of guessing it, then I might be. Am I on the right lines there? Is that validation and verification?
Yes, sort of. I think yes. If you validated your journey first and you had yes looked at the map and determined where you want it to go, and will you be able to do it? You don't suddenly find you've got to cross a ford or something like that.
Exactly.
Yes, and then your verification is did it actually work? Did you manage it?
Yeah. Well, that's it. So I've got it in my mind now. Yeah. Will it work? Should it work? Can it work? And then verification is, does it work in practice? Is it working in practice? That's yes. Great. Okay. Yes. Let's try and pick up some questions now. There are a lot of questions. Let's have a look at this one. How do you, Kirsten said, how do you validate CCPs, metal detectors that have been in place for years and are tested, verified multiple times every day? How do you go back and validate that?
Okay. Well, you could use some of the data that you've generated on a day-to-day basis and go back and use that as part of your validation. But if I go back to the beginning, if you were initially validating a metal detector, you would do some form of challenge testing on it. So you would start to put test strips through and a variety of different test strips at different sensitivities until you got down to the sensitivity that the metal detector would pick up. You would have to determine on the aperture where the sort of the detection capabilities are. You would have to think about the rejection mechanism and how it works, and it would be basically putting a lot of trials through at sort of your worst case, really. So it's determining where's the point of detection, what's the smallest level of detection, the orientation, the type of the product, the sort of moisture of the product, salt content, all of those types of things. And probably if you've got an awful lot of data that says on a day-to-day basis that these metal detectors are working and have been verified, it would be just checking back to see if you have some initial data, probably when the machinery was commissioned in, that did those types of trials. And if you had that, and then your ongoing data saying that this thing works on a day-to-day basis, that should form part of your validation.
Okay, brilliant. There is actually Robert Rogers from Metal at Toledo did a webinar earlier this year about how to do exactly that, validate your metal detector. So that's in the webinar archive, so take a look there as well. You were talking before about validation and verification with training programs, and somebody's asked, how do you validate a pest control program? Is that possible to validate a pest control program?
I think if you were looking at a pest control program, it's very much looking just theoretically at it, and you would be looking at who've you got coming in to do the pest control program. So is it somebody reputable, or is it somebody else? It's a little bit harder around some of the prerequisites, and certainly things like where it's a more paper-based system, probably to validate it. But it would be I suppose you're asking yourself again, if we use this particular pest control program, will it work? So it's just looking theoretically at the control program and looking at have the right types of pests been identified, and how often are we going to do checks? How often, what type of baits are being used, and that type of thing? Because you could potentially decide, I'm going to manage I don't know, birds, but you not have any birds, and your biggest hazard would be rodents and flying insects.
Yeah. So you're doing that sort of going through that process without even thinking about it sometimes.
You pretty much do. Yes.
Are we covered? What needs covering? How's it going to work, etc. Without calling it validation and verification.
I think so.
Yeah. Somebody asked a similar thing, is how do you validate PRP's prerequisites? And the way you was talking before, Ruth, obviously when your critical control points, like say for example, cooking or reducing microbes, etc. So, I mean, is that a similar thing, PRP's prerequisite procedures, as the pest control that you've just been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably if you start to look in the standards, they're asking you to validate practical control measures, if you like. So anything where you've got something that you're doing practically. So, for instance, cleaning and disinfection could be considered to be a prerequisite program. So you would validate your cleaning methodology, and that would be through doing a series of cleaning trials. So you would think about what it is you want to clean, how you're going to clean it, when are you going to clean it, what materials are you going to clean. You would then run the process, run the cleaning, and that's where you would do an awful lot of swab testing and ATP testing, however you decided you want it to actually measure that it was working properly. So some of the prerequisites, there's very definite sort of what I would call practical control measures and practical activities that you're doing, which you would then validate. Some of the others, for instance, the pest control, that's a lot more where you would be just looking theoretically at the documentation and determining, is it okay, is it correct?
Yeah, and also I think somebody mentioned on the pest control, when you look at the trends and things like that, then is that part of validation after the fact, in a way? That
it almost is. I mean, as I said, the boundaries on them get a little bit blurred, and what you are actually doing on an ongoing basis, perhaps when you're auditing your pest control and so on, that's you're verifying that it's happening and it is being done. But when you start to look at trending and you start to look at some of the information and the historical data that you've been generating, then what you're really doing is beginning to verify the validity. So you're verifying that it is valid.
Yeah. Okay. Guyan, I mean, he's talking about the Food Safety Modernisation Act, but he's saying in their new rules that there is no need to validate recall programs and supplier control programs. would you have any thoughts on that? That in the Food Safety Modernisation Act, they're saying that you do not need to validate recall and supplier control programs.
Okay, I suppose that's another one that's probably, rather than it being a practical control measure within your operation at a particular stage in your operation, it's a sort of a wider, more theoretical thing that you're doing. But I would still say that you need to think about it, because you could have set up an ineffective recall program that wouldn't work.
Yeah. Okay. Right. There's been a lot of discussion about metal detectors amongst the attendees between each other. I mean, Yusuf has said, why don't we start a discussion on the discussion forum? It's probably a good idea that, I mean, to take some of these discussions that you start in the sidebar are very limited. If you wanted to take any of those onto the discussion forum, I do urge you to join the forum, and you can debate things at length there, start new topics and things. So do that. If you're not a member, just go and sign up for free. What about labelling? Ebenezer has asked.
What about labelling?
What about labelling? How do you validate labels, your labelling program?
How do you validate your labelling program? Right. Well, I suppose initially you're going back to looking at have you got the right information on the label? So it's more, rather than practically, it's probably initially more theoretically. So if you're talking, I mean, are we talking about a label that's got the ingredient declaration, or are you just talking about labelling the date coding?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you, well, would then, let's say, to take that on then, that labelling, imagine if it's ingredients on some packaging, so it's printed packaging. So would that include making sure that the printer is capable of delivering almost perfect print that, you know, you can read, it's legible?
I mean, it's another one where this is probably being done as part of your sign off with the printer, because somebody will be responsible for the first sign off of any new labels. So making sure that that's there and that's happened. So that's almost, so long as that's there, that's proving that you're valid. You've got a valid label, and then on an ongoing basis, you are. Well, you'll be doing ongoing checks to make sure that that label is okay, it's legible, it's it depends whether it's pre-printed or whether you're printing it yourself.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Steve, our CCP is our labelling due to our product it's disappeared. Tree nuts, we validate through 5 independent signatures to review and verify. Blimey. Can you see any there in the sidebar?
Let's have a look. Loads and loads.
They're scrolling so fast, actually. Patrick said, in the pharmaceutical field, the production environment of validated processes stroke equipment is controlled, and so revalidation is conducted whenever there are frequent failures or major failures.
Yeah, which would make sense. If things are failing, something's right. Generally, if you start to get failures, your process isn't capable, or something isn't right. I mean, it could just be that you've got an equipment breakdown, but if you're getting repeated failures, that would bring you back to, it's probably something within your system, and that could mean that something within your system isn't valid.
Yeah, and you should find that through your verification procedures.
You should do, yes, and hopefully you will find it through your verification procedures rather than your customer finding it for you.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Well, that's a great note to finish on there, Ruth. It's bang on the hour. So thanks very much for today. We'll pick up on any questions. I'll email those. So if there's anything,
okay,
you can answer after, if you'll do that. thanks from myself, not just for today, for all 4 presentations that you've delivered this year. They've all been great, fantastic, different, and you're coming back next year, which is really pleasing as well. So thanks from me, thanks from the IFSQN, and thanks for all the attendees today and from the previous webinars.
Great, thank you. And can I just take this opportunity to say to everybody, well, happy Christmas and happy New Year, and I'll talk to some of you next year. Fantastic.
All right, Ruth, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to load the certificate in the sidebar now so you can get that. We send an email. Today's been recorded. We'll send an email within 24 hours with the webinar recording and the slides and a copy of the certificate as well, and a link to the follow-up discussion. So if you do want to chat on the discussion forum a little bit more amongst each other, that'll be fine. If anybody's watching this on YouTube, by the way, the recording, do subscribe to be updated. Give us a thumbs up, click the like button, and also comment on the YouTube as well. Let's interact all over. So thanks very much for today. It's Friday. Happy Friday to you. Have a great weekend. Have a food safe day. I'll let you know about next week by email. If the webinar's on next week, you'll hear about it by email. If not, there is one more webinar after that before we break for the Christmas period. So have a nice day. Take care, everybody.